Jami-Lee Ross.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As the House continues to debate this free trade, this bill which would help to implement many of the aspects of this free trade agreement, Mr Speaker, I would just like to acknowledge the ladies and gentlemen in the gallery who were part of the team leading the negotiations on this free trade agreement. Martin, with his able assistance. Mr Speaker, it's worthwhile acknowledging the hard work that these hard-working public servants...
The officials rather than their presence, because that's
the officials.
inviting problems. Thank you.
Tried to do something good, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, you would have made a good hall monitor, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I wish to acknowledge, I'll start again, I wish to acknowledge the excellent work of the officials that have helped in ensuring that this free trade agreement has been through the many stages of negotiations which have led to us now in this House debating a bill which will lead to the removal of many of the tariffs associated with goods and services to do with trade with Korea. Minister Tim Grosser has also been a passionate advocate for free trade throughout his whole career, and now it must be one of the highlights of his career to be able to stand as a minister in this government announcing the removal of tariffs, putting through free trade agreements through this parliament. Mr Speaker, he has done an excellent job too, and it's worthwhile acknowledging that. Mr Speaker, Korea is our 6th largest export destination. There is about $4 billion worth of two-way trade between our countries, and Mr Speaker, free trade agreements like the free trade agreement between Korea and New Zealand lead to better trade conditions for New Zealanders. It leads to better trade conditions for companies, those particularly that are exporting to countries that we have free trade agreements with. Mr Speaker, they are able to lift the number of products that they are exporting overseas, and that is a good thing for this country. Mr Speaker, we've heard some debate so far in this House from different parties, and we had quite a bit of debate on the Select Committee when the committee considered the free trade agreement. I have to say it's good to have the Labour Party and the National Party agreeing on something for once in this House. Quite often we're at loggerheads on issues, but I have to say I'm sitting on a Select Committee with the likes of Phil Goff and David Shearer, who have a huge amount of understanding and knowledge and wisdom when it comes to trade matters. As a younger member of Parliament, it's always good to learn from older gentlemen and the experienced ones on the committee. And Mr Speaker, I think it's worth acknowledging that this trade agreement follows on from a number of trade agreements that have been hugely beneficial for New Zealand, most notably the China FTA that Phil Goff was very much involved with. And Mr Speaker, when we're seeing the exports under that agreement going from about $2 billion in 2008 to about $11 billion now, we can see the huge growth potential that's there for New Zealand and for the people that wish to export overseas. And Mr Speaker, the reduction of tariffs that's covered under this bill predominantly is around the New Zealand side, but we must understand, of course, that there's about $229 million worth of tariffs that New Zealanders are paying when they are exporting to Korea. And the reduction in those tariffs is absolutely a good thing for New Zealand. Mr Speaker, I just want to address a couple of things that we've heard so far in this House. Firstly, from Julianne Genter, who said that it's unfortunate that New Zealanders haven't been able to look at this properly, or the Parliament hasn't been able to look at this properly. I have to say this agreement is going through exactly the same process that every trade agreement does. It goes to the Select Committee for consideration. Public submissions were called for from the public. The Select Committee, led by Mark Mitchell, conducted thorough hearings on those submissions, and Mr Speaker, it actually helped to inform us in a significant way our understanding of trade agreements and the Korean Free Trade Agreement. We were ably assisted by officials who I'm not allowed to name, but they also provided good input into this process as well. And then it's also worth remembering that since 2008, the Ministry has been conducting consultation with those that are interested in trade agreements like this. It's not as if it was secret that there was negotiations underway. It's been very open, the fact that we have been negotiating as a country with Korea. So let's just knock on the head this rubbish that it's all done in secrecy, no one knows about it, and that we haven't had thorough consideration. The fact we're debating this bill right now is part of that thorough consideration. And so, Mr Speaker, New Zealanders do get that opportunity. I also want to talk about the investor-state dispute settlement processes because, Mr. Speaker, it was a part of the submissions that dominated much of the discussion at the Select Committee. It's interesting to note many of the people that have fears around the investor-state dispute settlement provisions, because I think those fears are unfounded and they have been hyped up a lot by those who are seeking to try and stop New Zealand being involved in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. But it's worthwhile noting a few facts and figures around that. It's not a new thing for investor-state dispute settlement provisions to be included in our free trade agreements. We have the China Free Trade Agreement where we have this provision in place. The free trade agreement between New Zealand and the ASEAN nations, and the New Zealand and Malaysia. These are all trade agreements where investor-state dispute settlement processes are already in place. Have we ever been challenged as a government under those provisions? The answer is no. We have a good track record under these provisions. And so then the next question one might ask themselves is, what's the state of investor-state dispute settlement processes around the world? How many have been challenged? How many nations have been challenged under these provisions? Well, Mr. Speaker, the overall number of concluded cases, according to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development around the world, has reached 356. That sounds like a lot of challenges if you just look at that number, 356. But then, Mr. Speaker, how many actual agreements are in existence which have these provisions in them? And the answer to that is 3,268, according to UNCTAD. So, Mr. Speaker, around about 10% of trade agreements that have these provisions have led to challenges to the governments where investors have challenged those governments. It's actually a relatively small number considering the many, many decades that these types of provisions have been in place. And New Zealand has not been challenged at all under that. In fact, New Zealand have used provisions like this to try and protect our own investments, because it's not just a one-way street. It's not a case of these big foreign corporations that are out to get New Zealand coming to this country and challenging us. Mr. Speaker, in fact, it actually ensures that our investors are protected as well. And the most important point I think that the whole Parliament needs to realise around these provisions is that if we did not include ISDS provisions in our trade agreements, we would not have these trade agreements because, Mr. Speaker, they are demanded by many nations around the world. If we want to be a global player, if we want to help to reduce the barriers to trade for New Zealand companies wishing to export overseas, we have to give positive consideration to these provisions. And so, Mr. Speaker, when we hear the New Zealand First Party, when we hear the Green Party say they are opposed to ISDS provisions and they won't sign up to any free trade agreement that has ISDS provisions in it, they are effectively saying they are opposed to free trade. And when they say they are opposed to free trade, they are saying that they are opposed to the reduction in tariffs for New Zealand companies. And when they say they're opposed to the reduction in tariffs for New Zealand companies, they're saying they're opposed to greater growth. They're also saying they're opposed to more jobs for New Zealanders, and they're saying they're opposed to higher wages for New Zealanders. At the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. At the end of the day, we don't enter into these trade agreements for any other reason than we want to grow our exports, which leads to more jobs, which leads to greater growth and higher wages for our citizens. So, Mr. Speaker, let's have the Green Party and the New Zealand First Party being honest with the public. Don't go up there and try and whip up anti-sentiment towards the ISDS provisions without actually telling them what you really mean, because what they really mean, Mr. Speaker, is that they are opposed to our exporters having a better opportunity to exports to these countries. Mr. Speaker, they should be out there talking to the dairy industry, talking to the kiwi fruit industry, talking to the meat industry and the forestry industry, and talking to those industries about how they are opposed to the reduction in tariffs for those industries. The $500 million worth of exports in the forestry sector would be impacted. The $220 million worth of dairy products exported to Korea would be impacted. These are the real situations that free trade agreements like this deal with. Mr. Speaker, our negotiators, our minister, our government, supported by the other side of the House, have come up with a good free trade agreement here. It is worthwhile the House supporting it.
Mr. Speaker.
David